Let me start with a question that sounds simple, but really isn't. Who do you think subsidizes this country? As in, who do you think is paying? Because if you listen to most of right-wing talk radio, certain cable news hosts, or, that one uncle at Thanksgiving who's 3 beers in and absolutely feeling himself, you'd walk away believing that immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are basically a giant collective hand in your pocket. They're here illegally, we're told. They don't pay taxes. They live off welfare. They overload schools. They strain hospitals. They're freeloaders. They're moochers. They're a fiscal sinkhole dragging America into bankruptcy. You've heard it 1,000 times. But what if I told you that for the last 30 years, 3 decades, immigrants have, on balance, been subsidizing the rest of us? What if I told you that the people most loudly warning you about immigrants draining the system are doing so in direct contradiction to a report from, wait for it, a libertarian think tank that usually aligns much more with conservative economic views than with progressive ones? Yeah, that's what I want to talk about today. Hello, everyone. You're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today I want to talk about a report that was issued from the Cato Institute. Now, if you're not familiar with the Cato Institute, it is a libertarian think tank. And if you've ever paid any attention to their stuff, you would know that their theories and the information that they put out about economics and the country in general are very, very often aligned with conservative economic views. So when the Cato Institute puts out a report that tells us that the rhetoric that we're hearing very loudly from the right may not be true, it's worth taking a look at. But before we jump into that, let's take a look at some hot topics. All right, so let me get this one out of the way right off the top. If there are any of you who are actually right-leaning who listen to this podcast, there are probably times when you roll your eyes and think that I'm getting a little preachy, and maybe this is going to be one of those times. But I'm going to say there are moments when something happens and you just have to stop and say plainly and clearly, no, we're not doing this. Not again. If you've been paying any attention to the news for the past few days, you'll have heard about the post that appeared on Donald Trump's Truth Social account showing Barack and Michelle Obama depicted as apes. Not metaphorically, not subtly, not in some abstract political cartoon that could be generously, interpreted 6 different ways. Just straight up racist imagery that has been used for centuries to dehumanize black people. It stayed up long enough for people to see it, long enough for screenshots to circulate, long enough for the message to land. And that's sort of the key. But then, as always seems to happen, it disappeared. Pulled down, quietly, no meaningful explanation, no real accountability, just gone. As if that somehow erases what it said in the first place. But here's the thing. Deleting something doesn't undo it. It doesn't make it unposted. It doesn't make it less revealing. If anything, it confirms what it was. Because if there was nothing wrong with it, if it was harmless, if it was just a misunderstood Lion King meme, as was put forth by the White House, it would still be there. The only reason something like that gets quietly removed is because someone somewhere recognizes exactly what it is. And what it is racist. Plainly, blatantly, historically racist. There are certain images and tropes that come with centuries of baggage. Depicting black people as apes isn't just some random insult, somebody dreamed up last week. It's one of the oldest racist caricatures in Western culture. It was used to justify slavery, used to justify segregation, used to portray black people as less evolved, less human, less deserving of rights and dignity. It's not subtle, it's not ambiguous, and it's not open to generous interpretation. It's about as clear as racism gets. So when something like that shows up, whether it's posted directly or shared or boosted or whatever, we're not dealing with gray area. We're not dealing with, maybe it meant something else. We are not dealing with political satire that just went a little too far. We are dealing with imagery that has very specific, very ugly history behind it. And yet, almost immediately, the defenses began. He didn't mean it that way. You're reading too much into it. It was a staff member. It's just a joke. Liberals are too sensitive. You're making everything about race. You can practically set your watch by how these things are going to play out. And that's what makes this moment so exhausting, because we've seen it before, over and over and over again. Something happens, something gets said or posted that's clearly offensive, clearly rooted in ugly stereotypes or outright racism. And instead of a moment of reflection, instead of a moment of accountability, God forbid, the conversation immediately shifts into defense mode, deflection mode, minimization mode. The question becomes not, was this wrong, but how can we explain this away? But before I even get into the specific defenses, I want to talk about the broader context, because this is not happening in a vacuum. This isn't some random first-time incident that caught everyone by surprise. This is part of a long, well-documented pattern. Donald Trump's history with race did not begin in 2015 when he came down the escalator. It didn't begin with his birtherism attacks on Obama. It didn't begin with his presidency. It goes back decades. Back in the 70s, the Trump family real estate business was sued by the Department of Justice for discriminating against black renters. The allegation wasn't vague, it wasn't speculative. It was that black applicants were being systematically steered away from certain properties or denied housing altogether. The case ended in a settlement, as so many of his cases do, but it established an early pattern. Accusations of racial discrimination with a quick follow-up by denial and minimalization. In 1989, Trump took out a full-page newspaper ad, or multiple ads, calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty in connection with the Central Park 5 case. 5 black and Latino teenagers who were later fully exonerated by DNA evidence. But even after their innocence was established, beyond any reasonable doubt, he continued for years to insist that they were guilty. No apology, no acknowledgement of the harm done, just continued insistence. That then, of course, brings us to the birther movement, the years-long campaign to delegitimize Barack Obama's presidency by claiming, without evidence, that he was born outside of the United States, that he was somehow foreign, illegitimate, and not truly American. It was a conspiracy theory rooted deeply in racial resentment, and Trump didn't just flirt with it, he led it. He bludgeoned us with it. He used it as a political launching pad. And that's just scratching the surface. Comments about Mexican immigrants being criminals and rapists, calls for a ban on Muslims entering the United States, statements about, certain countries being shithole countries. Each one dismissed by supporters as exaggeration or humor or being taken out of context. Each one defended, explained, smoothed over. Individually, his defenders say, any one of these things might be misunderstood. Taken together, though, they form a pattern that's hard to ignore unless you're actively trying not to see it. I have a friend who always says, don't judge anybody on their best day or their worst day. Look for patterns. Patterns don't lie. And I think that applies here spectacularly. And that brings us back to this latest post. Because at some point, the conversation stops being about any single incident and starts being about what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to excuse, what we're willing to pretend not to notice. There's a phrase that you hear a lot these days. Don't let politics ruin relationships. You've probably heard it. Maybe you've even said it. Maybe you've had someone say it to you. The idea is that we shouldn't cut people out of our lives over political disagreements. That we should maintain friendships and family connections even when we vote differently or support different candidates. And in many cases, that's a totally reasonable idea. Disagreeing about tax policy or infrastructure spending or zoning laws doesn't have to end a friendship. Differing views on trade policy and healthcare systems shouldn't automatically make someone a bad person. Political differences are part of living in a diverse democracy. In fact, I'd say they're essential to it. But there's a line. There has always been a line. Because not every issue is just a matter of policy preference. Some things speak to values at a much deeper level. Some things aren't about whether you prefer one economic model over another. They're about how you see other human beings, what you find acceptable, what you're willing to defend. And when explicitly racist imagery is posted and then defended or minimized, we are no longer in the realm of ordinary political disagreement. We are in the realm of character. That doesn't mean everyone who votes a certain way is automatically a bad person. It doesn't mean that every conservative or every Republican share the same views. But when someone looks at something so obviously rooted in racist history and says, it's not a big deal, people are overreacting, or you're being too sensitive, that tells you something. It tells you something about what that person is willing to overlook, what they're willing to normalize. Because here's the truth. Defending something like that doesn't make the racism go away. It just makes it easier to live with. And that's where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask not just what politicians are saying or doing, but what we're willing to accept from them, what we're willing to rationalize, what we're willing to keep explaining away. At some point, repeated instances stop being coincidences. They stop being misunderstandings. They start forming a clear picture, a pattern, if you will. And the real question becomes, what does it take for people to look at that picture honestly? So with all the sheer chaos going on lately in the country over things like immigration and ICE and so on and so forth, certain topics have been pushed to the side and not unimportant ones. And one of those is the concept of climate change. We mentioned recently on this podcast that the president had made a statement when the cold snap in the Northeast started about how this record cold temperatures proved that, climate change was a hoax. So, he's still thinking about it on occasion. And there was a story that was reported on by multiple news outlets, including Politico. And according to a report by Politico, records have surfaced showing that climate advisors within the Department of Energy targeted a key Environmental Protection Agency finding. It wasn't a scholarly debate or scientific discourse. It was more of a calculated move to undermine the 2009 endangerment finding, which concluded that greenhouse gases threaten public health and welfare. Now, why is that significant? Because the endangerment finding is the legal backbone for regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. Undermining it isn't just some bureaucratic reshuffle, it's an attempt to dismantle the very foundation of federal climate policy. But, let's not pretend that this is an isolated incident. This is part of a broad pattern of climate denial and obfuscation that has been the hallmark of Trump's time in national politics. And more broadly, the GOP as well. From appointing climate skeptics to key positions to rolling back environmental regulations, the strategy is crystal clear. Sow doubt, stall progress, and prioritize short-term economic interest over long-term planetary health. So, consider this. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly in September of this past year, President Trump called climate change the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. It's not just a fringe opinion, it's a statement from the leader of one of the world's largest economies, dismissing the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change. And it's not just rhetoric. The administration has taken concrete steps to erase climate science from public discourse. According to the Center for American Progress, the EPA has deleted references to human-caused climate change from many of its websites, including statements from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Instead, the narratives now, talk about natural processes and conveniently ignore the role of human activity in global warming. But perhaps the most insidious tactic has been the suppression of scientific data. The London School of Economics reported that the Trump administration has been actively censoring climate science, removing online access to national climate assessment reports, and dismissing staff working on future editions. This isn't just denial, it's an epistemic assault on the very institutions that provide us with the knowledge to understand and combat climate change. Now, you have to ask the question, if they're so sure that climate change isn't real, why would you hide information? Why not just show all the information and show why it's wrong? So that leads us to the GOP's role in all of this. Well, outright climate denial has become less politically tenable as time goes on. Many Republicans have shifted to a strategy of misrepresentation. ABC News had a report that said the GOP has transitioned from denying the existence of climate change to misrepresenting environmental and energy policies. This includes, false claims about renewable energy and downplaying the impacts of fossil fuels. In Arizona, for one example, despite experiencing record-breaking heat waves and prolonged droughts, Republican lawmakers continue to reject the scientific consensus on climate change. As reported by Cronkite News, Representative Paul Gosar dismissed climate science as, fake science and likened warnings about climate change to death cult predictions. This, despite the fact that climatologists have no doubt that the climate is changing for the worse due to human activities. The consequences of this denial are not just theoretical, they're tangible and devastating. The United States has experienced an increasing number of billion-dollar climate disasters, from wildfires in California, hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, and so on. Yet the administration's response has been to double down on fossil fuels, roll back environmental protections, and withdraw from international climate agreements. According to Earth.org, in the first year of Trump's second term, the administration has reversed numerous environmental regulations, slashed funding for climate research, and opened up projected lands for oil and gas exploration. This isn't just a policy shift. It's a wholesale retreat from anything that vaguely resembles environmental responsibility. And we can't forget the financial incentives at play. The Center for American Progress reports that climate deniers in Congress have received over $52 million in lifetime campaign contributions from the fossil fuel industry. This isn't just about ideology. It's about money, as most things are, and the influence of entrenched interests. So, where does that leave us? In a precarious position, to say the least. The deliberate undermining of climate science and policy by those in power poses a significant threat to our environment, public health, and future generations. It's a stark reminder that vigilance and advocacy and informed discourse are more critical than ever. And as I started off this piece by saying, because of all the other chaos that this administration has built into everyday life, global warming has been put on the back burner. No pun intended. Sometimes you can look at a piece of legislation and you immediately realize this is one of those moments where the packaging and the reality are two very different things. I want to talk about the SAVE Act. Now, if you've heard Republicans talking about the SAVE Act, which is short for the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, you've probably heard it described in the simplest, most harmless way imaginable. They'll tell you it's about voter ID. They'll tell you it's about election integrity. They'll tell you it's about making sure only American citizens vote in American elections. And on the surface, that sounds totally reasonable. Of course, only citizens should vote. Of course, elections should be secure. You say that out loud, and most people will nod along because that's not a controversial principle. But here's the thing about political messaging in 2026, and frankly, in the last decade or so. You cannot just listen to the slogan. You have to read the fine print. Because more often than not, the slogan is the shiny wrapper, and what's inside the package can be something very different. The SAVE Act is being sold as a simple voter ID bill, but when you actually look at the language, when you look at the real-world implications, it becomes clear this is not just about showing your driver's license at the polling place. It's about requiring millions of Americans to prove their citizenship in ways that sound simple in theory, but become complicated, sometimes impossible, in real life. And that's where this stops being about election security and starts looking a whole lot like voter intimidation dressed up as patriotism. Now let's start with what the bill says. The official pitch is straightforward. We need to make sure that only U.S. citizens vote in federal elections. That's it. That's the line. That's the bumper sticker. That's the talking point you'll hear repeated on cable news and right-wing podcasts. And again, on its face, who's going to argue with that? If you frame it that way, opposition sounds almost suspicious. If someone says, hey, this bill might be a problem, the immediate response becomes, why? You don't want secure elections? Why don't you want secure elections? Don't you want only citizens to vote? It's a clever rhetorical setup because it shifts the burden of explanation onto anyone raising concerns. Suddenly, you're not just debating policy, you're defending yourself against implications that you don't care about election integrity. But here's where we need to slow down and take a look at reality for a moment. Non-citizen voting in federal elections is already illegal. It has been illegal for a long, long time. You cannot legally cast a ballot in a federal election if you are not a U.S. citizen. Full stop. That's already the law. So then the question becomes, how big of a problem is this really? Is there some massive wave of undocumented immigrants lining up at polling places swinging elections one way or the other, slipping through the cracks. No, there isn't. Study after study after study has shown that non-citizen voting in federal elections is extremely rare. And when it does happen, it's usually accidental or involves tiny numbers that have zero impact on election outcomes. We're talking about fringe, microscopic instances. The kind of numbers that don't even come close to affecting a school board race, let alone a national election. So if this isn't a widespread problem, why build an entire piece of federal legislation around stopping it? That's where the second layer of the SAVE Act comes into focus, because the bill doesn't just say, show an ID when you vote. It moves into territory that essentially requires voters to prove their citizenship when registering, and in some cases to reprove it when voting. Now think about that for a second. Proving you're you is one thing. Showing an ID with your name and photo on it is one thing. Most Americans can do that easily enough. But proving citizenship, that's a different level of documentation entirely. You're talking about birth certificates, passports, naturalization papers, official documents that many don't carry around, don't have easy access to, or have never needed to present in order to vote before. And for millions of Americans, perfectly legal, perfectly eligible voters, that requirement is not as simple as lawmakers make it sound. Let's just talk about married women as one example for a moment, because this is one of the most obvious real-world complications that supporters of this bill tend to gloss over. There are millions of women in this country who changed their last names when they got married. Their birth certificate has one name, their driver's license has another. Their voter registration has the married name they've used for decades, or it has their maiden name if they've always lived in the same area and have been registered to vote since they were 18. If this law requires citizenship documentation that matches current identification exactly, what happens when those names don't line up neatly? What happens when a birth certificate from 1978 says one thing and a driver's license from 2024 says another? Are those women suddenly required to produce additional paperwork, marriage certificates, court documents, extra proof just to exercise a right they've had their entire adult lives? And it's not just married women. Anyone who has changed their name for marriage, divorce, adoption, gender transition, or any other legal reason could run into similar hurdles. Imagine being told that in order to vote, you now need to track down a decades-old document stored in a filing cabinet somewhere in another state. Imagine dealing with bureaucratic hoops just to prove you are who you've been your entire life. Now multiply that by millions. This is where the conversation shifts from election security to access. Because the more complicated you make the process of proving eligibility, the more likely it is that some people, perfectly legal voters, will decide it's not worth the hassle, or won't be able to navigate the system in time, or will simply just be turned away. And when that happens, you don't have a fraud prevention system, you have a deterrence system. That's what this starts to look like. Not a tool to stop illegal voting, which again is minuscule, but a mechanism to make legal voting more burdensome. And keep in mind that this is being championed by the GOP, and there are more than a few right-wing influencers out there who have made disturbing comments about whether or not women should even have the right to vote. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that these guys love the SAVE Act. And the context around this bill matters as well, because legislation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a political environment. And right now, that environment includes a lot of rhetoric about election security, rhetoric that seems less about solving real problems and more about creating the perception of a problem. You've probably noticed that over the last several election cycles, there has been a constant drumbeat of claims about voter fraud, massive fraud, widespread fraud, fraud everywhere, fraud so severe that the entire elections are supposedly illegitimate. And yet, time and time again, when investigations actually happen, they find almost nothing. A handful of cases, tiny numbers, nothing remotely close to the scale suggested by the rhetoric. But here's the political reality. If you repeat something often enough, people start to believe it's a major issue, even if the evidence doesn't support that belief, even if the data says the opposite. So you create the perception of a crisis, then you propose legislation to solve that crisis. And anyone who questions the legislation is framed as opposing election security. It's a neat little cycle. And then we start seeing comments from figures like Steve Bannon suggesting that ICE agents should be stationed at polling places during midterm elections. Think about that image for a moment. Federal immigration enforcement officers present at voting sites. What message does that send? Who is that meant to reassure, and who is it meant to intimidate? If you're a naturalized citizen or someone from an immigrant family or someone who simply doesn't trust government agencies to treat you fairly, the presence of immigration enforcement at a polling place doesn't exactly scream welcome. It sends a very different signal. All these things taken together, stricter documentation requirements, increased rhetoric about fraud, talk of enforcement, presence at polling locations, you start to see a pattern. And the pattern looks less like a good faith effort to secure elections and more like an effort to shape who feels comfortable participating in them. And here's where we need to zoom out and talk a little bit about something bigger, how elections are structured in the U.S. The Constitution gives primary responsibility for running elections to the states. That was not an accident. The framers understood that a centralized federal government controlling all the aspects of voting could create opportunities for abuse and overreach. So they distributed that power, allowing individual states to manage registration procedures and voting procedures and logistics. Now, that system is far from perfect. No system is perfect, but it was designed to prevent exactly the kind of top-down national interference that could be used to shape voter participation. When federal legislation starts imposing new requirements that affect how states manage voter registration and access, it raises important questions, not just about policy, but about balance of power, about federal versus state authority, about whether we're moving towards a system where access to the ballot can be shaped by national political priorities rather than local administration. And underlying all of this is a simple but crucial point. Voting is not just another bureaucratic process. It's a foundational right, the mechanism through which citizens participate in their own governance. Any law that makes that process more complicated deserves serious scrutiny, not just from one party or another, but from anyone who cares about maintaining a functioning democracy. Because the goal should always be twofold: secure elections and accessible elections. Both, not one at the expense of the other. When security measures start creating unnecessary barriers for legitimate voters, we have to ask whether those measures are actually about security at all. And that brings us back to the SAVE Act itself, to the gap between how it's being marketed and what it may actually do, to the difference between solving a real problem and creating a new one in the name of the other. At the end of the day, this isn't just about documentation requirements or administrative procedures. It's about trust. It's about whether citizens trust that the system is designed to include them rather than discourage them. It's about whether legislation strengthens participation or quietly narrows it. Because a healthy democracy isn't measured by how many people it keeps out. It's measured by how effectively it ensures that every eligible citizen can participate without unnecessary barriers or intimidation. That's the standard we should be holding every voting law to. Not the slogans, not the campaign ads, the real world impact. And when you apply that standard here, the questions surrounding the SAVE Act become impossible to ignore. All right, and that brings us to today's main topic. I want to talk about a white paper from the Cato Institute titled Immigrants Recent Effects on Government Budgets, years 1994 to 2023. It's a very dry academic title, which is exactly why I'm going to explain it to translate it into normal human language. So first, let's talk about the Cato Institute, because the source is important. The Cato Institute is not some lefty, open borders, Bernie Sanders adjacent advocacy group. Far, far from it. Cato is a libertarian think tank based in Washington, D.C. They're part of what you would broadly call the free market, limited government world. They believe in small government, low taxes, deregulation, free markets, and individual liberty. In many ways, they sit to the right of mainstream Democrats and often overlap with conservatives, especially on economic issues. They are not bleeding heart liberals. They are not sitting around talking about equity or collective responsibility. Their worldview is much closer to let people keep their money, let the government get out of the way, and let the markets do their thing. Now, I'm not saying I agree with them in the broad scheme of things, but when Cato puts out a report saying, hey, actually immigrants have been a net positive for government budgets for decades, I just want to make sure that you realize that's not coming from the left. That's coming from a libertarian institution that conservatives often cite, especially for dollars and cents issues. And that's what makes this report they release so fascinating and, frankly, so devastating to a lot of right-wing immigration rhetoric. Because this isn't AOC or the New York Times or some progressive nonprofit making the case. This is Cato, the kind of place that Republicans love to quote when they want to argue against taxes or regulations. So, what did Cato do? They looked at government budgets from 1994 to 2023, a full 30 years. They didn't cherry pick years. They didn't take a short window. That's basically a lot of people's entire adult life. They analyzed how much immigrants, both legal and undocumented, paid into federal, state, and local governments in taxes versus how much they cost in benefits and services. We're talking about income taxes, payroll taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, the whole shebang. And then they compared that to native-born Americans. This is important. They weren't asking, are immigrants morally good or are immigrants culturally enriching? Those are different conversations. And at the end of this segment, I'll mention to you a book that you should read that covers the whole gamut. But they were asking very cold, numbers-based bean counter questions. Do immigrants cost more than they contribute? And the answer consistently was no, they contribute more. Here's the first major takeaway. From 94 to 2023, immigrants were a net positive for government budgets in almost every single year. Almost every year. Not just recently, not just during good economic times, over 3 decades. The only exceptions were 2020 and 2021, which, not coincidentally, were years of massive economic crisis. In other words, when the entire economy was on life support, immigrants were also affected. I know that shocks you. But outside of those crisis years, immigrants were consistently paying more in than they were taking out. Let that sink in for just a moment. For 30 years, the group most often demonized as a drain on the system has actually been helping keep the system afloat. Now, why is this happening? Cato identifies a few big reasons. First of all, immigrants are more likely to be working. According to the report, immigrants were over 12 percentage points more likely to be employed than native-born Americans. Think about that. 12% is not a small gap. That's huge. More employment means more income. More income means more taxes paid. More taxes paid means more revenue for the government. So the idea that immigrants are sitting around not working is obviously just wrong. It's the opposite of reality. They are, statistically speaking, more likely to be working than people born here. Second, immigrants are more likely to be of working age. On average, immigrants are about 20 percentage points more likely to be in the working age population than native-born Americans. Why does that matter? Because working age people pay taxes and don't yet draw heavily from programs like Social Security and Medicare. A lot of immigrants come here as young adults to work. Many of them leave before retirement. So they're paying into the system without drawing from it later at the same rate. That's basically the dream scenario for any government budget. You pay in for decades and then you don't take out much later. That's the opposite of a fiscal burden. Now, let's talk about government benefits, because this is where a lot of conservative rhetoric lives. You've heard it. Immigrants are all on welfare. They're bleeding the taxpayers dry. They get, billions of dollars in free health care. According to Cato, that narrative simply doesn't hold up. Immigrants, on average, consume fewer government services per person than native-born Americans. Specifically, they impose 34% lower costs on old age programs like Social Security and Medicare. Why? Because many immigrants aren't eligible for these programs, or they haven't been here long enough to qualify. And as we just discussed, many leave before retirement anyway. So while conservatives love to talk about immigrants bankrupting Social Security, the data suggests quite the opposite. Immigrants are actually helping to support it. They're paying into the system while drawing less from it. Now, property taxes is another area. This is a piece of the puzzle that gets almost zero airtime in political debates. In 2023 alone, immigrants paid nearly $110 billion in property taxes. Over the entire 30-year period, that comes to about $2.2 trillion. And that's just direct payments. Cato also estimates that immigrants indirectly increased property values, which generated another $1.1 trillion in additional tax revenue in that same period. So when you hear someone say immigrants don't contribute, you might want to remind them that immigrants have been helping fund schools and roads and police and local governments for decades through their property taxes. Even undocumented immigrants pay property taxes, often through rent, since landlords pass those costs along. Now we get to the jaw dropper. Cato estimates that overall, immigrants reduced government deficits by $14.5 trillion between 1994 and 2023. Let me say that again, because it's really good. $14.5 trillion. That's not pocket change. That's not a rounding error. That is a massive fiscal contribution. So when politicians scream about the national debt and then turn around and blame immigrants, they're basically full of baloney. They're yelling at the wrong people. Now, how this collides with right-wing rhetoric, we have to talk about politics, because this is where things get spicy. A huge chunk of right-wing immigration rhetoric rests on the idea that immigrants are a fiscal burden. They take more than they give. They live off welfare. They drain public resources. They're bankrupting the system. But, here's the thing. Those claims don't just contradict progressive think tanks. They contradict Cato, a libertarian organization. If you're a conservative who trusts Cato, there were many of them, when they say taxes are too high or government is too big, you don't get to just ignore them when they say immigrants are a net fiscal positive. That's not how credibility works. So, what should we take from all of this? First, we should probably stop pretending that immigration is primarily a budget problem. The data just does not support it. Secondly, if we actually cared about reducing deficits, which is questionable, we'd be having a very different conversation about immigration, one that focuses on how to better integrate immigrants into the tax system, not how to exclude or deport them. Third, we need to be honest that a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric isn't really about economics at all. It's about culture, identity, and fear of change. Because if it were truly about money, the numbers would force a rethink. So here's my takeaway. If you want to argue about immigration, fine. Have that debate. Talk about borders, enforcement, fairness, whatever. But don't pretend this is about protecting taxpayers. Because according to a libertarian think tank that usually leans right, immigrants have been helping carry the load for decades. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth sitting with the next time someone tells you that immigrants are bleeding America dry. Now, one more thing I want to leave you with in this particular topic. As I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, the economic dollars and cents part is just one aspect of immigration. But if you want to learn about some of the others and what the actual real story is behind immigration and what it adds or takes away from the United States, I have an excellent book to recommend. The book is called The Truth About Immigration. It's by an author by the name of Zeke Hernandez, who is himself an immigrant. He came from Uruguay and is now a U.S. citizen, a PhD holder, and a professor at Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania. The book gets into a lot of other topics besides the economic. I mean, it talks about the economics too, but it talks about some of the other aspects of immigration that you might not be thinking about or that get glossed over. I just finished it, and it's an easy read, even though it's talking about some complex subjects, and I highly, highly recommend it. All right, and that brings us to this week's high note. And I'm just going to jump in here because sometimes the best way to start a story is to just start the story. Right now across the United States, in high schools you've probably never heard of, in towns you might drive past without stopping, there are teenagers walking out of class. Not to skip school, not to cause trouble, not to go viral on TikTok. They're walking out because they're trying to protect their friends. Let that sink in for a moment. In a political climate that feels louder and angrier and more divided by the day, some of the most hopeful acts of courage are coming from kids who aren't even old enough to vote yet. Kids who can't donate to campaigns, kids who can't run for office, kids who, by every traditional metric of political power, are supposed to be powerless. And yet, they're not acting powerless at all. Across the country, high school students are organizing protests and walkouts in response to the aggressive immigration enforcement and rhetoric that have intensified under the current administration. They're not doing it because it's trendy. They're doing it because someone they sit next to in math class is scared. Because someone they eat lunch with doesn't know if their parents are coming home that night. Because someone they grew up playing soccer with is suddenly living with a level of fear that no teenager should have to carry. And these students are looking at that reality and saying something simple. Something I think is profoundly American. Not on our watch. Now, let's be clear about something. Teenagers have always had a reputation. Adults love to talk about kids these days, usually while shaking their heads and lamenting phones and social media and attention spans. We've been hearing for years that young people are disengaged and apathetic and glued to screens, too cynical to care about anything bigger than themselves. Turns out that narrative might be off just a little bit. Because what's actually happening in communities across the country is the exact opposite. Students are organizing walkouts. They're creating Know Your Rights guides for immigrant families. They're building support networks for classmates whose parents have been detained or targeted. They're raising money for legal defense funds. They're translating documents. They're helping younger siblings understand what is going on. In some cases, they're literally standing outside schools and neighborhoods to document ICE activity, making sure families know what's happening and what their rights actually are. They are, in short, stepping into the kind of civic engagement that we always claim we want from young people. And here's the part that really gets me. Many of these students are doing this in communities where speaking out isn't exactly popular. In conservative areas, in small towns, in places where putting your head down and staying quiet probably feels a lot safer than standing up and speaking out. But they're doing it anyway. Because when your friend is afraid their family might be torn apart, staying out of politics stops being a real option. When someone you care about is hurting, neutrality starts to feel a lot like complicity. And these kids, these teenagers, are choosing compassion over comfort. One student put it in the simplest possible terms. You can't let despair take over. That's it. That's the whole thesis right there. You can't let despair take over. It's such a small sentence, but it carries so much weight. Because despair is very easy right now. Turn on the news for 5 minutes and you can feel it creeping in. Scroll through social media and you can practically watch it spread. There's this constant drumbeat of crisis, outrage, and exhaustion that makes a lot of people just want to check out entirely. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. When everything feels overwhelming, withdrawal feels like self-preservation. But these students are choosing something different. Instead of retreating, they're engaging. Instead of giving in to hopelessness, they're creating pockets of hope. Instead of saying, this is just how things are, they are asking, what can we do about it? That question, what can we do about it, should be the beating heart of democracy. It always has been. Not just voting, though voting is extremely important. Not just policy debates. Those matter too. But ordinary people looking at the world around them and deciding that they have some responsibility for making it better. And sometimes those ordinary people are 16 years old. Think about the courage that takes. High school is already a pressure cooker. Social dynamics and academic stress, trying to figure out who you are. It's a lot. Now add the decision to publicly stand up for something controversial, to risk criticism, to risk being misunderstood, to risk becoming that kid who's always talking about politics. But a lot of them are doing it anyway. Not because it's easy, not because it's safe. I guess because it's right. And in doing so, they're reminding the rest of us of something we sometimes forget. Moral clarity doesn't require a college degree, a political title, or a certain age. Sometimes it just requires empathy and a willingness to act. These students aren't waiting until they're older to care about their communities. They're not waiting until they have more power. They're not waiting for permission. They're recognizing that citizenship isn't just a legal status. It's a set of responsibilities to one another. When a classmate is scared, you show up. When a neighbor is targeted, you speak out. When policies affect real people you know, you don't pretend it's abstract. You engage. All right, folks. Thank you again for downloading another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. This, of course, brings us to the end of that episode, and I want to mention to you, if you haven't stopped by already, the podcast now has a website, www.neighborontheleft.com. It has all the links for social media platforms for the podcast that you can use for contact. It has the email address. It has a blog feature where I'm now adding blog posts that match the episode topics. And speaking of episodes, it also has a web player where you can listen to or download any episode of the podcast. So stop by and check it out. I'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.